My name is Seth Lewis, and on behalf of Harvard University Division of Science, the Harvard Library, and the Harvard Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment in our Science Book Talk lecture series. I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's event with Venki Ramakrishnan, who's presenting his latest book, Why We Die. Sorry. We're good? All right. Why We Die. The New Science of Aging and the Quest for Immortality. Before we get into the book, a few things to keep in mind. Our next event is Monday, May 13th. Sean Carroll joins us again for the second installment of The Biggest Ideas in the Universe, Quanta and Fields. So that'll be fun if you like that. For more information and to stay up to date on all things Harvard Science Book Talks, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, and check out our YouTube channel where we post the videos and recordings. Our event tonight will consist of a discussion followed by 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. At that time, we'll come around with some microphones. If you raise your hand, we'll come to you. And then lastly, once tonight's event concludes, we'll make our way upstairs to Jefferson 450 for a reception and a book signing. Cheese cubes, all the fun stuff. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Venki Ramakrishnan shared the 2009 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for uncovering the structure of the ribosome. A member of the National Academy of Sciences, Venki runs his research group at the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, England. From 2015 to 2020, he served as the president of the Royal Society, one of the world's oldest scientific organizations. He's the author of the frank scientific memoir, Gene Machine. Joining him in conversation is Antonio Regalado. Antonio is a reporter at MIT Technology Review, where he covers genetic engineering, in vitro fertility, and longevity research. Before joining MIT Review, he lived in Sao Paulo, where he wrote about science, technology, and politics in Latin America for Science, National Geographic, and other publications. From 2000 to 2009, he was a science reporter at the Wall Street Journal and a foreign correspondent. Tonight, they'll be discussing Why We Die, a lively delve into death and the science of mortality. Covering the recent breakthroughs in scientific research, Venki's book examines the cutting-edge efforts to extend lifespan by altering our genetic makeup. But might death serve a necessary biological purpose? What are the social and ethical costs? Venki will tell us. So without further ado, the floor is to our speakers. There you go. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you for hosting this lecture, Jeff. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is probably a hall far more familiar to my son, who was in physics undergraduate here from 94 to 98 before he decided to become a cellist. So I like to joke that he and I are both failed physicists. But anyway, here I am. And I want to tell you in about 20 minutes some key sort of highlights about longevity that are described in my book. So the first thing is that lifespans can vary enormously. So if you look at, for example, the mayfly here, it's the record holder at the short end. It lives only for a day. Butterflies, like the monarch, have a rather variable lifespan depending on which phase of the cycle they're in. But then there are others which live very long. So at the other extreme is the Greenland shark, which lives for over 400 years, which is an impressive thing for a vertebrate. And here's a Galapagos tortoise, and they've known to live for over 170 years, which raises the possibility that there's a Galapagos tortoise walking around now, which might have encountered Darwin. So there you go. So the question is, what is this variation in lifespan due to? After all, we're all made of the same material, DNA and proteins and lipids and so on. And of course, we're all all of them is subject to chemical assault. So how come some species live over 400 years, another dies in a day? Well, there is one interesting correlation, and that is a correlation between lifespan and size in mammals. So if you look at mammals, the larger the mammal, on average, it's more likely to live a longer time. And there's an evolutionary reason for it, and that explains really the evolutionary basis of lifespan. And that is that you can think of aging, which results in death, as an accumulation of chemical damage to our molecules and cells. Now, we're subject to this chemical damage from the time we're conceived, so it happens even in utero, all the way through our lives until there's some critical systems failure and we die. Now, because of that, evolution has, all life forms have evolved very sophisticated damage correction mechanisms and repair mechanisms. And these mechanisms take up energy. They take up resources and energy in order to produce them, to maintain them, etc. Now, if you're a mouse, which lives for about 2 years in the wild, it doesn't make sense for evolution to have selected for extraordinary efforts to maintain the mouse so that it doesn't age and lives for a very long time, because that mouse in the wild is going to be killed off by a predator or starved to death or drown or something long before it ages. So in that case, it's more favorable for evolution to select for rapid growth and maturation and rapid production of lots of offspring, because ultimately all evolution selects for is fitness, which is the efficiency with which you can pass on your genes. Of course, if you're a large animal, then the equation's different. It does pay because you can live a longer time, have more time to find one or more mates and produce offspring over a longer lifespan. Now, this isn't the entire story because there are outliers, and I'll talk about a couple. For example, there's this Brandt's bat. Now, bats are about the same size as mice, in fact, even smaller. Brandt's bat you could hold in the palm of your hand. It lives for 40 years compared to 2 years for a mouse. Now, the reason is bats can fly, so they can escape predators. They can forage over a much wider area. And therefore, it does make sense for them to live longer. They'll be able to produce more offspring over a longer life. Similarly, like this bird, this cockatoo lives for 80 years, which is a pretty respectable lifespan for a bird, for an animal that size. But birds in general live longer than terrestrial animals of about the same size. So just one lesson is that evolution, there is no program to die. Evolution just doesn't care what happens to you as long as you're fit and you've passed on your genes. That's a fundamental lesson from evolution. There are animals that appear not to age. For example, there's an animal called the hydra, a freshwater animal, and another one called the immortal jellyfish. Now, these animals apparently do not have what's called biological aging, and that means, in specific terms, there's a phenomenon called Gompert's law, which says that the rise in mortality with age is exponential. That is to say, when you're 10, it's very unlikely that you're going to die in the years from 10 to 11. But if you're, say, 95, there's a very good chance you won't make it to 96. Okay, and so that's this exponential Gompert's law, and these species don't show Gompert's law apparently, but it turns out even in these species, if you wait long enough, you do observe aging. For example, Galapagos tortoises were thought not to age, but old Galapagos tortoises are going blind. They have very slow movement. They have wrinkly skin or wrinklier skin and infections and so on. Now, the way these animals do it is by constantly regenerating their tissues. And this is a little bit like plants. You can take plants, you can cut them off and they'll regenerate. You can cut off a starfish's arm and it'll regenerate. And that's slightly different from us mammals, which have very more limited capacities for regeneration. So the question is, how long do we live? How long can humans live? Well, life expectancy has more than doubled over the last 100 or 150 years. But it turns out that even in olden times, people lived for very long periods. For example, there are composers who've known to have lived to, be almost 90 years old, 200 years ago. And so maximum lifespan may not have changed that much over the years, even if average lifespan, which is due to eliminating infectious disease, infant mortality, better public health, better treatment of many other diseases of old age like heart disease and cancer, that's gradually increased our average life expectancy. But in terms of maximum life expectancy, the record holder is this woman, Jeanne Calment, who apparently well into, until she was past 100, used to smoke a cigarette and have a glass of port every day after lunch, which, I wouldn't recommend that you follow. But she also consumed over 1 kilo of chocolate a week. And I could get behind that, actually, I think. So she lived for 122 years and died in 1997. And but nobody else in the last 30 years, there's no record of anyone else living past 120. So the feeling, and very few people make it past 110. In fact, here in Boston, there's a New England centenarian study headed up, of which Tom Pearls is a co-director. And, the number of centenarians has not actually gone up significantly, even though the number of number of people over 110 has not gone up significantly, even though the number of people over 100 has been going up due to health advances. And so I would say the natural biology limit is probably about 110. And beyond that, you're really struggling, and nobody really seems to have made it past 120, except for this unusual French woman. So the other thing I'd like to point out is that breakthroughs in understanding aging have come from the strangest people and places. The one thing that is really striking is many of the advances have come from studying fundamental biology in areas completely unrelated to longevity or aging. They're curiosity-driven research that explores major pathways. They've often come at it from unexpected angles. One of the pathways I discuss in the book is the TOR pathway, which is a major metabolic pathway. The people who, initiated it had no clue that it would have such a big, to do with aging. And they've also come from very strange people and places. And I want to just give you a couple of examples. So one favorite of the anti-aging community is a drug called rapamycin, which, maybe we can get into later when we talk. Now, rapamycin was discovered completely accidentally because a group of Canadian scientists went to Easter Island because they felt that the natives of Easter Island weren't getting tetanus. So maybe there was something in the soil that was protective. So they looked at a bunch of soil bacteria to ask if they could isolate antimicrobial compounds. One of them, called rapamycin after Rapa Nui, which is the name for Easter Island, turned out to be an antifungal compound. And it was worked on at a company in Canada called Irist by a guy named Suren Sehgal. And he was interested in it, and he wanted to see if it had other properties. And he collaborated with people at the National Cancer Institute, showed it had anti-tumor properties, and he wanted to work on it. But at some point, Irist got bought by Wyeth, which was in New Jersey, and they all had to close down the lab and move to New Jersey. And nobody was interested in rapamycin or his bacteria. But he was a rather stubborn guy, so he grew up a huge batch of this bacteria that produces rapamycin, packed it in an ice cream carton and stored it in his home freezer with a label marked "Don't Eat," presumably for his children. So, and then he moved to Wyeth and persuaded his people to continue working on it. And it turned out to have immunosuppressive and anti-inflammatory properties, and became an approved drug for immunosuppression for graft transplant, for organ transplant patients. And so it became very useful. And then people wanted to ask, how did it work? And how does it, what's its target? And that led to the discovery of TOR and the TOR pathway, which then led to the discovery that it had potential anti-aging properties. Now, another big field in longevity and aging is Alzheimer's. As we get older, one of the biggest risks today is that eventually, if we live long enough, many of us may get dementia. And dementia is a disease of protein malfunction and possibly of protein aggregation. And this is related to a set of diseases called prion diseases, where proteins undergo a transformation into an abnormal form and start to aggregate and cause malfunction. Now, the earliest such disease was called Kuru, which was a disease present in the natives of New Guinea. This is Papua New Guinea, which is just north of Australia. And an American scientist named Carlton Gajdusek went to do a fellowship in Melbourne. And then he was sent by his advisor, McFarlane Burnett, and I think he wanted to go to investigate this weird disease called Kuru that was prevalent among these tribes in Papua New Guinea. And he was one of the people who realized that these tribals were actually, the Foray tribe had this practice of cannibalism. They would eat the brains and other organs of their ancestors as part of a ritual ceremony. And, there was some connection. Some anthropologists had made this connection, and Gajdusek then showed that you could take brains of infected, Kuru victims and then transmit the disease by that extract, by brain extract. And he did that in chimpanzees. And it was the first example of a transmissible disease in that way. And, Alzheimer's could well be a prion disease. We just, we don't go around eating the brains of Alzheimer victims, but it has all of those characteristics. Gajdusek is also interesting because he has the unfortunate distinction of being both a Nobel laureate and a convicted child molester. So, because he brought back some of these young boys from the Foray tribe to live with him outside in Frederick, near Washington, D.C. Now, finally, I want to say there's a huge explosion in longevity research with both real advances and some rather dubious claims. Now, the reason there's an explosion is because all societies are aging, and people are living longer and fertility rates are going down, with the result that the population age distribution is skewing towards older people. So it's extremely important that we find ways to have people remain healthy and productive and independent as we age. And so all developed countries are investing considerably in aging research. Of course, there's also a lot of private money with some of these motives, but not necessarily exactly the same motives. But this is the age distribution curve. This is where we are now, and you can see that it's fattening up at the older end, predicted by in 2066. And this, of course, has led to a proliferation of literature. There have been over 300,000 papers in the last 10 years. So, a book like mine, even though I worked on it for 3 years, could cover only a minuscule fraction of this research. And it's not published in just the mainstream big journals, but there is a whole proliferation of journals devoted to longevity, and new ones are cropping up every day. And along with that, there are about 700 startups which have longevity as a goal of one kind or another. And some of them will say they're really about healthy aging and not about life extension. And then there are sort of various mixtures. And there are tens of billions of dollars invested in these startups, many of them within, a few miles radius of this place. Okay. And along with that, there are also dubious claims, So this is from Tom Check, who's written a book about RNA and telomeres. And he gave me this slide which says telomere shortening is considered one of the hallmarks of aging. And so there, you can go on Amazon.com and you'll have lots of, things you can buy that will apparently lengthen your telomeres. But of course, these are not FDA approved. There are no clinical trials. It's not clear what their basis is. Now, at the same time, there are some promising approaches. Now, one of the things that the aging community agrees on is caloric restriction. It turns out that if you restrict animals to the bare minimum calories that they need to survive without losing weight or starving, then those animals often will have reverse many of the symptoms of aging. They will, if you look at some of the markers of aging, that will also change. And so there's a lot of effort to ask, can you mimic the effects of caloric restriction? And rapamycin, that drug I mentioned, is one such drug. But of course, rapamycin is an immunosuppressant. So you remember, it also has the potential to make you prone to infections, to wound healing. It has many other side effects as well. And people are trying to figure out what to do. Now, another interesting area that I discuss is this thing called parabiosis, where you can connect an old animal with a young animal so that their blood supplies are joined. And this means that the blood is going from the young animal into the old animal and then coming back around again. And it turns out that these animals, it's a rather grotesque experiment. And the earlier versions of this were even more grotesque, where they hadn't socialized the animal and one animal bit off the head of the other animal to which it was attached because it didn't like being attached to him. But anyway, they do things differently now. And what they've found is that the blood of the young animal helps to reverse many of the symptoms of aging in the older animals. So the older animal benefits from the young blood. And it's also true that the young animal worsens from the old blood. And this has led many labs to launch large-scale investigations into what is it about young blood that's different, and which of these factors that are different are actually beneficial, and if so, how do they act? So you can see this is a very long-term program. But that didn't stop a number of companies. As soon as these reports came out, a number of companies started up getting young donors to donate blood, extracting the plasma from them and selling it to rich people for transfusions. And, one of these companies was shut down by the FDA, and then it opened up under a different name. And then when the CEO was asked about it, he said, well, look, the trouble with clinical trials is they take too long. We don't want to wait until, for clinical trials. So that is some sort of the attitude in some cases. And it hasn't stopped some people from taking matters into their own hands. And this is Brian Johnson, a tech billionaire, who decided to keep it all in the family, so to speak, because he got transfusions from his son, and he also gave blood to his father. So it's a sort of intergenerational blood transfusion progress. And this is a guy who spends, I think, about $2 million a year on longevity efforts, to keep, and his goal is to not age, and he wants to defeat aging. And but I think he stopped the blood transfusion because he said it wasn't really actually improving his markers. But he thinks it still, ought to work. You just have to figure out how to do it. So, and then another aspect is that many of our cells enter a stage called senescence. This happens all the time, but as we get old, we tend to accumulate senescent cells. These are a problem in themselves, but they're also a problem because they secrete inflammatory compounds, that actually are meant to attract the immune system to the site of action. And that has a deliberate purpose, but as we age, it becomes a problem. You get this large-scale systemic inflammation. And people have found that if you can specifically target senescent cells, then that does improve the symptoms of aging. So this whole field called senolytics is another big area of aging. And the final thing, which I think is most challenging, but also one of the most exciting, is something called cellular reprogramming. And we all know that, we start off from a a single cell, which then divides and then eventually differentiates until a full-grown animal, the baby, is born. And during this process, the initial cell divides into 2 cells, which divides into a number of cells. And in the early stages, if you were to take any one of those cells, that cell has the potential to form any kind of tissue. So it's called a pluripotent stem cell because it can generate any kind of tissue. But later on, you get more specialized stem cells. For example, these hematopoietic stem cells can only generate any of the cells of the blood system. But that's a large number of cells, but still it's a limited number. For example, all of the cells of the immune system and the red blood, the precursors of the red blood cells, all come from hematopoietic stem cells. Then there are other cells which generate all of the cells of the nervous system, including neurons and glia and so on. And so as we age, both the number and the quality of stem cells decline. So we get stem cell depletion, and the remaining stem cells are what are called clonal. They're descendants from a very few stem cells, which have not necessarily been selected for, ideal properties. Rather, they're the stem cells that happen to reproduce faster. And so that is a problem. Now, people have figured out that you can take fully developed cells, differentiated cells, and actually make them go backwards in development. And these are the most famous experiment was by a scientist named Yamanaka, who showed that only 4 factors alone could take an adult cell all the way back to pluripotent stem cells. Now, of course, if you try to grow these pluripotent stem cells, you often get teratomas, which are cancerous tumors. So it's not, there is a cancer risk with these things. And there is also the problem that if you, so to get around this, people are trying to reprogram it so these cells go backwards only a little bit and not all the way back to pluripotence. And, but then, you're dealing with a population, so you're not sure that everything is just going to be going back a little. Some of the population may go back all the way, even though the treatment was transient. So this is a field that has shown some very promising results in animals. But, applying it to humans, I think, is going to take time. It's going to take time to establish safety, long-term effects, all of these things. So I think I'll stop there and maybe we can have a conversation.
Thank you.
Oh,
yeah. Wherever you like. Oh, I see there's already a copy here. So I am Antonio. I'm a journalist at MIT Technology Review. I like to write about longevity schemes in particular when they involve billionaires.
I should point out that I read many of Antonio's articles in the process of writing this book.
Well,
and I actually reached out to him to steal one of his great lines in my book.
Right. I'm a sort of a science reporter, so I'm always contacting scientists. They don't always as often reach out to me, especially not Nobel Prize winners who want to check a footnote. So I was very impressed. And so the one word I would use about the book is scrupulous. This is a scientist who is not a gerontologist. He's from outside the field. He doesn't have skin in the game in that sense, but who's decided to assess modern molecular biology really in the light of aging. And I would say one book to read is this one if you want to know what the questions are and what the facts are, because scrupulous is not really a word that's so often used in this field as we heard. Yeah. But I do want to know why you got interested. I mean, many of the people in this field, some of them young, some of them old, it's at some point they realize that everybody's going to die. And once they figure that out, they really think that is the biggest problem that there is and that they should dedicate themselves.
Yeah. So I was interested probably for a variety of reasons. One is, of course, it's a big existential question. And I think humans have wondered ever since we were humans, why is it that we have to die one day? Why do we age and why do we die? And why do different species last for very different lifespans. Those who own pets know that they're going to outlive many pets, many generations of pets. But for most of our existence as a species, there was nothing we could do about it. And the other interesting thing is, I think we may be the only species that's aware of our mortality. Other species are aware of death, but not necessarily that they have an expiration date, on them. And so that was one reason to explore that. And I also felt that molecular biology had made real advances in understanding aging over the last few decades. For much of its existence as a science, it was regarded with some disdain by mainstream molecular biologists. In fact, one famous molecular biologist, Gary Ruvkin, who's from around here, found that, he was working on these, mutations in the worm, and he found that one of his mutations was involved in longevity. And he's quoted as saying, "Oh, great, I'm in aging research now. My IQ is going to halve every year I'm in it." So anyway, so that was the thing. But I think things have changed, and there is more rigor, partly because the NIH and the MRC and others are really encouraging research in aging and longevity. So a lot of mainstream biologists, including Gary Ruvkin, have gone into it. And at the same time, there's a huge amount of hype. And I think, you're as familiar as I am. And I thought, somebody who's objective and who doesn't have, an anti-aging company, I'm not selling a product. The only thing I'm selling is this book. And that's, after I wrote it. So I think, I think that was the idea, is to try and take a hard look at the field.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the books in this space have very different titles. It's How Not to Age, Ageless, Hack Your Body Clock, Young Forever. These are books that I saw recently at a book display. Why We Die, it's a little bit discouraging, let's face it. But I still have the same question. In the age of molecular biology, gene editing, genetic engineering, do you think that it is possible to stall aging, that immortality is within reach? Because, as you say, evolution didn't plan for death. It's just sort of an accident. So maybe we can solve it.
I think that is the feeling of what I would call the extreme optimists in the field. I think there's no physical or chemical law that says you have to die after a fixed amount of time. For example, we know that species, even vertebrates, can live over 400 years. Now, if you look at the metabolism of these species, it's very different from ours. Many of them have very slow metabolism. They're quite different. So the question is whether you can tackle the aging processes and still keep us as who we are as humans, and whether then we can do that in a safe and effective way. The question of whether we should is a whole different thing, which is philosophical. But I think it's theoretically possible, but I would put it on the same category as there's no physical or chemical law saying we can't colonize other galaxies or outer space or even Mars, and I would put it on sort of that level, and it would require huge breakthroughs, which we haven't made yet.
Right. But why is it a hard problem? I mean, you brought up embryonic stem cells. I mostly write about embryos and CRISPR babies and stuff. And so I have become very aware that immortality is all around us, because we may die, but cellular life, barring an asteroid strike, is not going to stop. So the immortality is right here, right before us. And, Dr. Yamanaka even knows the 4 factors to endow a cell with that. So why is it that we can't extract that from?
Sure. I think the reason is that we're a very complex system. It's unlike treating a single cell or a single line of cells like germ cells, which have evolved mechanisms to minimize damage. But I also think germ cells do age, but what we're doing is combining efficient mechanisms of repair so that they don't age as fast as somatic cells with a brutal selection process. I mean, what people don't realize is that, first of all, women are born with well over 1 million, germline cells, and yet, by the time of menopause, it's declined to essentially 0, and that's because it's brutal selection in the process of going from the germline precursor to the actual, egg that's ready for fertilization in each menstrual cycle. So, it's not clear that you can do that with a somatic body. We're not, able to apply that sort of brutal selection process. And if we were able to somehow delay aging or reversing, you'd have to do that in a coherent way. So all of the systems in the body are able to do that. And then there's one final frontier where you have a brain where regeneration doesn't actually occur, and naturally. And if you regenerate, would you be able to regenerate all of the states and connections that make the brain what it is? The memory, the cognition, etc., that the brain has. That's really a sort of unsolved problem. And so I think, yes, you can do it for single cells. You might be able to do it for simple tissues even. To do it for the whole body over a very long period, I think could be a real challenge. But I agree that, there are optimists in the field, some, again, not very far from here, who, think
Right.
this is a solvable problem.
Well, longevity, it's a very selfish concept because it's about me, right?
Yeah.
It is about me. But it's not the only way to achieve longevity. Like some famous composers you mentioned, their name is still on our lips through the reproduction of the genetic information that we have. So I'm kind of interested in more speculative versions of immortality. For instance, cloning. Like, you can buy an insurance on a cow, and if your cow dies, they'll get you a new cow, same genetics, pretty similar cow.
Yeah.
And then maybe with one of these chat GPTs, you could train it on all your best ideas and best jokes and things you always say. I mean, it is finite. So for another person, that would be a very convincing replica of you. Like,
Yeah, but that's not
maybe
you.
we're thinking too narrowly about immortality, and that it's actually, again, I feel like it's right here. I could get cloned and I could get inside the computer.
Yeah, but that's, it's not so far off from having offspring, but the reality is those clones are a bit like your offspring. They may have descended from you, but they're not you. It's you are a particular, individual. And so I think the reason we fear death is not because, of this theoretical immortality. The reason we fear death is we don't want to lose our existence as an individual, as a unique individual. And I want to just paraphrase, Woody Allen, although I know that he's been canceled, but it's a great line, which is that he said, "Look, I don't want to live on in the hearts and minds of my fans. I want to live on in my apartment." And he says, "I don't want to be immortal through my works. I want to be immortal by not dying." And so, I think that's really, I think, a lot of what's driven human culture. I mean, all humans have been obsessed about immortality and death for a long time. You could argue many of the religions all have different versions of immortality. Some Abrahamic religions believe that the body will resurrect itself corporeally, and they insist on burial traditionally. Other religions say, well, the body might disintegrate, but you have this soul. This would be the equivalent of, dumping your brain. You can think of that as some sort of a soul, and, dumping your brain onto some other, material form. And so I think, this is just part of human culture.
Yeah. We're going to open it up into questions in just a second. There'll be somebody running around with a microphone, so get your questions ready. Make them short, please. Let's see. One subject that arises, this company, Altos Labs, for instance, I wrote a story about them. The first one, I forced them out of stealth, which was a lot of fun.
That was a big article.
But then they got very upset. They said, no, we're not about life extension or rejuvenation, even though it's like basically in their name, rejuvenation programming. They say we're about health span. Okay, so health span is maybe some more achievable concept. And I don't know if you guys have seen the movies Logan's Run. This is like a classic 70s movie. It's utopia. Everybody's having a great time. And then when they're 30, there's a ceremony and they get killed. So they have perfect health until 30. This is what you call compression of morbidity. Tell us, I mean, this seems like a more realistic goal.
Yeah.
So let's hear about compression of morbidity.
So this is a very interesting thing. So if you ask the NIH or the MRC, what is their goal? They'll say their goal is healthy aging, not life extension. Okay. So the idea is that, as we age, we acquire lots of morbidities. We get, heart problems, we get diabetes, some of us get cancer, we may eventually get dementia. And so these are all the morbidities of old age. And we also get frailty, we get osteoarthritis, aches and pains, etc. So the question is, can we keep people healthy for a larger fraction of their lives so that as we age, we continue to remain healthy, but without increasing lifespan? The problem with that concept, it's a very nice concept, but the problem with it is that virtually every medical advance has led to an increase in longevity as well as increase in healthy years. So that the number of years that we spend with these morbidities of old age has not actually gone down. It may even have gone up slightly because, it's sort of slowed down. And so the real question is, can we increase health span and keep that morbidity period actually shorten that morbidity period? So we're still dying on average at about the same age, but we're staying healthy for a longer time, so we're compressing that morbid period. I'm not sure, it's achievable. There's no reason to think that we could do that, because also what will happen is people, if you have a perfectly functioning machine, like you're perfectly healthy, what would suddenly cause you to decline and drop dead? There's no logic to that. So it could be that we're simply postponing that. The one fact that I've come across during writing this book that suggests it might be possible in some people is that Tom Pearls told me, and he runs the New England Centenarian Study, that and he's published data which show that if you look at these people who live very long, people over 105 or 110, it turns out they're extraordinarily healthy, well into over 100 for most of their lives, and go to a rapid decline and then, die. So they've somehow compressed morbidity. But these people may have some unusual combination of genetics and life history. It's not something that might be generally applicable to the population. So I think it's still an open question. Of course, Aldous Huxley did it before Logan's Run, even in Brave New World. Everybody lives very healthily, and then they're taken to some, sort of like a death ceremony, and then they're all put to sleep when their time comes. Well, that's a perfect compression of morbidity. And also in our ancient history, when we were hunter-gatherers, we had also very high compression of morbidity. We were healthy. And the moment that we acquired any defects, we wouldn't be able to hunt and we'd just starve to death or be attacked by a predator. And so our decline would be extremely rapid. But that's not the compression we want. We're looking for, living extremely healthily and then one day dying in our sleep. And that's not, necessarily achievable.
So do we have a question? Anybody? Lots of questions. Maybe we'll start at the bottom and then go upwards.
Hello. Thank you for this fantastic presentation and discussion. I would like to get your thoughts on perhaps leveraging the mechanisms of protein translation to treat aging and age-related diseases. For example, improving the fidelity of the translation or the rate of translation or some particular proteins.
This is a great question for Venki because he is the
That is
co-discoverer of the thing that does the translation.
So it turns out that translational control is a fundamental process in several aspects of aging. In particular, a broad phenomenon called proteostasis, which is maintaining the ensemble of proteins you have in your cell in the correct stoichiometry and functional form. And when that breaks down, then you do have aging. And in fact, some of these pathways, like the Tor pathway, actually partly work by shutting down global protein synthesis because there's an accumulation of dysfunctional proteins. And so it pays to shut down or slow down protein synthesis while which makes it easier to deal with the problem. And there are other pathways which, when the cell faces stress and, accumulation of unfolded proteins, which happens with age, is one such stress, they can also use a different mechanism called the integrated stress response, which shuts down protein synthesis. So there are people working, and all of these are drug targets, by the way. I felt a little bit like the character in one of Moliere's plays who found that suddenly late in life, he discovered that all his life he had been talking in prose. And I feel like, accidentally I'd been working in an area related to longevity research. There we are.
Thanks for the fantastic talk. So one of the questions I had was, do we have an estimate for how much of a role external chemicals in the environment play a role in sort of triggering initial conditions that then ultimately lead us to disease? Because one of the things that I understand from, about the DNA is that we do have very good, mechanisms that have evolved, as you mentioned in the beginning, for DNA damage repair. But one of the things that speeds up DNA, DNA damage is, external mutagens and things like PFAs, which is becoming a talking point. So do we have an idea of how much this factor contributes and whether, actually addressing it will sort of help longevity?
I don't know in terms of quantitatively, I don't know. I do know that if you have extreme exposure, for example, to carcinogens or radiation, then you're dramatically increasing the mutation rate. But one of the big discoveries in the DNA damage field was by Thomas Lindahl, who showed that you could have DNA in just pure water, and it would still accumulate thousands of DNA damage events in the course of a day. And so that really provided the rationale for why DNA damage DNA repair is so essential and so conserved from bacteria to humans, because it's DNA damage is a natural process of life itself. And I think what these other chemicals can do is perhaps increase that basal, add on to that basal rate.
Thank you for this talk. I've always understood aging as an increase in entropy because of my background. But you're saying that there is no physical law that says that there is aging. Is that then a misunderstanding? Or is
it's not a misunderstanding. It's a slight confusion about the second law of thermodynamics, which applies in a closed system where there's no energy input. And if you apply external energy input, then of course you can always reduce entropy. And that's all living systems. The reason that they're able to reduce entropy in cases is by application. They all require external energy. And we all know this from your attic or your hard drive. If you don't expend energy, you get entropic buildup. But if you really actually put in energy, you can, keep entropy low. So I think that's the real reason that, you can't just say it's, entropy will take over. Of course, many of these systems that correct damage, which require energy, are not perfect. So it's possible that over the very long run, you may not be able to outrun the entropic contribution, okay? And so even if you manage to, say, circumvent this 120-year limit, there might be a limit later on. You've just slowed it down by these processes.
Hi, my name's Frank Gillette. Going back to the health span set of ideas, what about the sort of many practical suggestions to sleep a full night's sleep, avoid eating too much fish with mercury in it? There's a bunch of very practical things that are sort of a preview of these health span ideas, which seem to have good science behind them. Staying aerobically fit. Turns out strength training is now coming up in the things you should do to improve your health span. So where does that fit into all your thinking, or is that taking all that as a given?
Great question.
Beyond that?
It's a great question, because near the end of my book, I've said that the trio, including ones you mentioned, the trio of a healthy and moderate diet. So you're avoiding obesity, avoiding all of those things, and having a healthy diet with a good proportion of nutrients and fiber. Regular exercise. And I take your point about weight training, because that really helps to build muscle mass. And loss of muscle with age results in frailty. That's one of the causes of hallmarks of aging and eventually death. And then getting a good night's sleep. It turns out many of the repair mechanisms in biology occur during sleep. And sleep we associate with having eyes and a central nervous system. It's not true. They're very primitive animals also undergo essentially the molecular biology equivalent of sleep. And so sleep is a very highly conserved process throughout evolution. And it's because it involves, these repair mechanisms. So all of these are very important. The couple of things I didn't mention in the book, one is getting health checks for some of the key indicators of aging for which we have actual remedies. For example, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. These are things that can actually improve health with old age. And there are sociological indicators. For example, it turns out that longevity is also inversely correlated with loneliness, and social isolation, things like that. But they're somewhat hard to separate cause from effect, I think.
Hi, yes, thanks again for the great talk. So I was curious at the beginning when you were saying that a lot of the advances came from strange and unusual places and people. So these days in science, say with the startup culture or with all the different journals of aging that you showed that were cropping up, how can scientists and to an extent funding agencies keep their eyes open or account for that information coming from more unusual places?
Yeah, I think this is, of course, a serious problem. But I would say the good side is that certainly where I work in the UK and in the US and in countries like Germany, there is a certain broad-mindedness from funding agencies about what constitutes useful science. And all of these companies, NIH is the National Institutes of Health, and MRC is the Medical Research Council, and yet they support a large amount of basic fundamental biology, even the National Cancer Institute or National Aging Institute. Big fraction of its research would be fundamental cell biology or molecular biology. And it's a recognition that we need to understand the fundamental basis of things before we can understand or even to interpret what goes wrong. And I think but we should always keep that in mind, because there's always pressure, often from Congress or from governments, to try and get more directed research in. And what we should point out, and it's a very easy case to make, is the importance of fundamental science and always reserving some fraction of the budget for really basic research. And I'm happy to say that, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, again, medical in its name, or the Wellcome Trust in Britain, also take a similarly broad-minded view.
Hi. I'm wondering what your point was by mentioning Dr. Carlton Gadushek's work on for tribal people. The cannibalism killed people, actually. it's anti-longevity. So I was wondering what's the point with linking anti-longevity to longevity?
Well, no, this cannibalism, they weren't actually killing each other and eating them. These were ancestors who died, and they had this ritual consumption of some of the organs of the ancestors.
It's an immortality ritual.
And so the idea was that the ancestors would live on within themselves. That was the idea. Well, it caused them this disease. The problem was if the ancestor was infected with the disease and they had either died of it or they didn't know about it, but they had been infected, then you would inadvertently acquire the disease as a kind of infection. It's not inevitable.
There's an obvious interest in the scientific causes of aging, and then there's an obvious interest in the economic aspects that we all face. Thinking beyond that, and I'm sure you did that, if we were to achieve indefinite age, did you think about how that would feel?
This is a very personal thing, and there are, I have to say there are plenty of people who view mortality as a problem to be solved because they're quite happy to want to live forever. I joke that these are people who love their lives so much that they don't want the party to end. And he said it best when he said, some of these people when they were young they wanted to be rich, and now that they're rich they want to be young. Okay, and so I have to say that my view is that if you look at big creative efforts in many fields, certainly in the sciences, but in many fields, it's often come when people are young, and that's when big, huge breakthroughs have been made. You look at really big discoveries and ask, when did this happen? How old were these people when they made this discovery? It's often when they were young. Kazuo Ishiguro, whom I got to know over the last few years, has said this even applies to writing. He outraged all his fellow writers by saying, most people have written their best novels by the time they're 40. And he gave a whole list of people, including Tolstoy with War and Peace and so on. So why does this happen? And one idea that Ishiguro had is that it's not about the health of our body or even our brains. It's the fact that when we're young, we're facing everything for the first time. So everything is novel. We don't have preconceived biases. We're fresh. We're more open to ideas, to interpretations, and that's all part of creativity. And of course, cognitive decline does occur with age. There's no question about it. If you're my age and want to learn, abstract algebraic topology, it's going to be a very uphill climb. So I think that is a fact. So my feeling is, if we have the same group of people living very long, you can't be reproducing at the same rate, or people won't die, but people will keep being born. That'll lead to a population rise. That's also not terribly sustainable given what the Earth is facing today. So the alternative is you have the stagnant society, and I think regeneration is good for everything, including culture and society.
I should say the last two chapters of the book really get into some of these sociological questions. He gets right into them. I mean, there's declining birth rates. I mean, the fertility rate in the United States, it's like
it's just
each person is creating in their lifetime like 0.8 new people, which isn't enough to keep it going. So we're already headed a little bit towards this scenario of like super low birth rates, longer life, and inverted demographic pyramids, which could have problematic consequences. Last question?
Last question. Hi, thank you. So I have two questions. My first question is, you mentioned a couple promising approaches, and I'm wondering if the molecular mechanisms behind some of these approaches are known. For example, you mentioned rapamycin mimics caloric restriction. Do we know anything about its molecular mechanism? That's my first question. Yeah. And my second question is, I once read in a book that turtles have longer lifespan because they have a very low respiratory rate. I think some turtles, they breathe like 0.3 breaths per minute, for example. Yeah. So is there any scientific basis?
Yeah. So in general, there's a very strong correlation between metabolic rate and longevity. So it's inversely related. So if you have a very high metabolic rate, then you're more likely to die quickly. And it's also related to size, because it turns out smaller animals have a higher metabolic rate. And it is true that the turtle, but also the bowhead whale the Greenland shark certainly has a very low metabolic rate. And in fact, it's so slow that it's amazing that it can actually find things to eat, which is not what you would think of for a shark. But anyway, so that's one thing. And I'm sorry, I forgot the first one.
So you mentioned a couple different...
Oh, rapamycin.
Yeah, rapamycin. Molecular mechanism.
So rapamycin the target of rapamycin is TOR, which is, the reason it's called TOR is TOR stands for target of rapamycin. And so it is actually what rapamycin acts on. It's a kinase which, involves a big long cascade which has widespread metabolic effects, including shutting down protein synthesis, but that's only one of its many effects. So many of these targets are known. And, the other one, which is another drug that's been touted a lot, is called ISRIB, which acts on an aspect of controlling protein translation. Again, sort of related to my field. And that's also, the target is very well known.
So great. Thank you so much, Venki. I can't resist reading a quote that I found in the book. It's actually a quote from Barbara Ehrenreich, which you quote. And it says, "You can think of death bitterly and with resignation and take every possible measure to postpone it. Or more realistically, you can see life as an interruption of an eternity of personal non-existence and seize it as a brief opportunity to observe and interact with the living and ever surprising world around us." So thank you, everybody, for spending a little bit of your interruption here. And if you can afford a bit more, in the reception.
Thank you.
Thanks.